Hiya Seven, welcome to this penultimate lesson of Year 7. How exciting. So today we're moving away from the boy in striped pyjamas now that we've done our assessment and finished the course with that. And we're going to look at this poem by John Agard called Checking Out My History. This is a poem which we can link to our Black Lives Matter topic that we've kind of looked at over a couple of lessons as well, as will shortly be revealed. So let's get started. So firstly, let's listen to the poem aloud. While we watch it, or after you watch it, I want you to think about what he is saying and how he is saying it. And then we can move on to the next tasks after we watch it.
The first line in our history book, I seem to remember, was West Indian history begins in 1492 with the arrival of Columbus. It's that very Eurocentric view. Nothing exists until the European has entered the arena. The retelling of history depends a lot on who's telling the story. Them tell me what they want to tell me. Bandage up my eye with my own history, blind me to my own identity. Them tell me about 1066 and all that. Them tell me about Dick Whittington and he cat. But Toussaint L Ouverture, you know, them never tell me about that. I would like to think that the poem has a celebratory side. It's celebrating characters such as Toussaint L Ouverture or Mary Seacole or the Amerindian past. But in a poem, you're not writing a history book. You're not writing a piece of journalism. So no matter how well-intentioned you might be, or how crucial the facts might be, that wouldn't make a poem. So it came out in that way, like a counterpoint of two voices. So one voice is the nursery rhymes, counterpointed by a celebration of historical characters. Them tell me about the man who discovered the balloon and the cow jump over the moon. Them tell me the dish run away with the spoon, but them never tell me about Nanny de Maroon. When I think of Nani, I'm thinking of like you're casting a spell. So I think from those words you get the feeling, how can I deliver this? This is a woman who used the traditions of her African ancestry. So that becomes a kind of a spell against an oppressive regime at the time. Nani, seafar woman of mountain dream, fire woman, struggle, hopeful stream to freedom river. You can write a poem in Creole, but it might be a very reactionary poem. It might be very sexist. So it doesn't mean that writing a poem in Creole automatically means you're right on. But you're using all of your registers of speech, your linguistic heritage, and it gives a pride simultaneously in language, but also in history. Them tell me about Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but them never tell me about Shaka the Great Zulu. Them tell me about Columbus and 1492, but what happened to the Carib and the Arawak too? Let's say I'm playing with words the way you might play with musical notes. So a text becomes like a musical score. And sometimes the voice of delivery doesn't show itself until after the poem is written. Them tell me about Florence Nightingale and she lamp, and how Robin Hood used to camp. Them tell me old King Cole was a merry old soul, but them never tell me about Mary Seacole. The poet hopefully keeps us in touch with the vulnerable core of language that makes you what you are. It keeps you in touch with the heartfelt and vulnerable, fragile, complex, contradictory nature of the human beast. Them tell me what they want to tell me. But now I checking out me own history. I carving out me identity.
Okay then, so now that we've heard Agard reading his poem aloud, I want us to re-look at the title of the poem. Why has he written it ungrammatically according to standard English? What is the effect? So remember the poem is called Checking Out Me History. What is the effect of this? What does it make us feel when we read that? What does it make us think of? And why do you think it's why he's done this in an ungrammatical way according to standard English? Okay, once you've done that, we can move on. So our learning outcome for today. Number 1 is to understand the main message of Agard's poem. Number 2 is to identify and evaluate context of the poem. And number 3 is to work independently to identify white and black history and culture in the poem. Okay, next we're going to look at voice. So who is speaking in the poem? What type and tone of voice do you imagine? Is she or he happy, sad, angry, frustrated, critical, or something else? What emotions, what emotive language is coming through here? So they're the next questions I'd like you to answer. So now we're going to look at a summary. Now this is probably going to be a lot of me talking, but that's okay. So the speaker repeatedly says how British colonisers taught students only what they, that is the British, wanted those students to know. The British education system essentially hid colonised people's history from them, in effect blinding people like the speaker to their own identities. British educators taught colonised students about the Battle of Hastings, which was fought in 1066, and other irrelevant stuff like that. They taught students about Dick Whittington, who, according to British folklore, rose from poverty with the money he made from selling his cat to a rat-infested country. But the British educators never bothered to teach students about Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint was a visionary man who rose up from slavery. He beat back the battalions of the French Emperor Napoleon, which is how Haiti gained independence from the French and became the first black democracy in the Americas. Toussaint was a metaphorical thorn in France's side and the powerful leader of the Haitian Revolution. The speaker says more about what was taught by the British, this time alluding to even more trivial things, like the man who invented the balloon and popular English nursery rhymes. But the British never told the speaker about Nanny de Maroon. Nani was a visionary woman known for escaping slavery and founding her own town for other escaped slaves in the mountains of Jamaica. Nani was a brave, ferocious fighter. Her actions provided a source of hope for other enslaved peoples, like a stream that flowed into a deeper river of freedom. The British taught the speaker about Horatio Nelson, who was regarded as one of the greatest sea warriors in British history, and the Battle of Waterloo, which took place in Belgium in 1815 and marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars and victory for the British. But the British never taught the speaker about Shaka the Great Zulu, one of the most important monarchs from the Zulu kingdom in Africa. The British taught the speaker about how Christopher Columbus came to America in 1492, but they never mentioned what became of the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, who were mostly killed and displaced after Columbus's arrival. The British taught the speaker about Florence Nightingale, an English social reformer who gained fame as a nurse during the Crimean War. They even taught the speaker about mythological figures like Robin Hood and Old King Cole, but the British never taught the speaker about Mary C. Cole. Mary C. Cole was from Jamaica and had to travel on her own a great distance to the site of the Crimean War. When she first volunteered to go to the war, she was denied by the British War Office. However, the undeterred Mary C. Cole still travelled independently to cold, snowy Russia, where she helped heal the wounded troops and gave hope like a bright sunrise to sick and dying men. The speaker repeats the opening line of the poem, lamenting how the British only taught colonised students what they wanted to teach them. Now, however, the speaker is learning the history of the speaker's own people, and by doing so, the speaker is creating an identity through carving it out. Awesome. So that's our summary then. So now I'd like you to complete this table. So what might be a good idea to do is just to Google the poem Checking Out My History so that you can actually see it written down, and then we can start filling this out. So what I want you to do is fill in this table on white historical events or figures, white culture, and black historical events and figures that are mentioned in the poem. So, for example, 1066 and the Battle of Hastings was mentioned, so that would be an historical event. White culture, such as Dick Whittington or Robin Hood, that could be seen as white culture. And then black historical events and figures like Toussaint L Ouverture and Mary C. Cole, and figures like that can go in that column there. So fill that table out for me. All right then, so now let's do an analysis. Let's look at this quotation here. So, no dem never tell me about dat. What is the effect of adding two negatives in this sentence? So as you can see, we've got no and never repeated in the same sentence. So what is the effect of this double negative? Agard also repeats this line with some small alterations twice more in the poem. Can you find where he repeats the line? And why does he do this? Lastly, I want you to think about what effect this has. Why is he repeating this? Why is he changing it slightly? What do you think he wanted his reader to get from this? Actually, just going back to this, you do well to mention the word refrain in your answer. All right then. So let's do a bit about Toussaint Louverture. I want you to research him further. What can you find out about him? Is there anything interesting? Would you be able to do a character profile? Would you be able to write a paragraph or a poster or something like that about this figure? Be creative as possible. You could even do a podcast. And now let's look at this figure, Nanny de Maroon. So I'm not going to get you to research her. I'm going to tell you some more about this lady. Okay, so Nanny de Maroon stands out in history as the only female among Jamaica's national heroes. She is described as a fearless and Asante warrior who used military tactics to fool and beguile the English. Nani was a leader of the Maroons at the beginning of the 18th century. She was particularly important to the Maroons in the fight against the British during the First Maroon War from 1720 to 1739. She has been immortalised in songs and legends, but certain facts about her have been documented. So she had exceptional leadership qualities. Her influence over the Maroons was so strong it appeared supernatural, said to be connected to her powers of Abaya. She was good at organising guerrilla warfare. This kept British troops out of the mountainous areas. And she was a chieftainess or wise woman who passed down oral legends and encouraged the continuation of customs, music, and songs that had come with the people from Africa and that instilled them with pride and confidence. In 1739, when Kao signed a second treaty declaring peace with the British, Nani was very angry as she felt this would lead to subjugation by the British. Nani died at the instigation of the British sometime around 1734. She is still held as a symbol of the desire never to yield to captivity. So she's an incredible woman. She's incredibly inspirational, incredible determination and motivation to lead her people. So it's amazing, in fact, that I had never even heard of her before I studied her in year 10. So yeah, quite interesting really. So if there's any words there that you're not sure on, I would like you to research them. For example, the word Abaya. Ta-da. Or asante. Or even subjugation. So have a research of them and maybe write down the definition for me. So we're going to find out some more about Shaka, the great Zulu warrior. So I want you to watch this video and then we can move on.
Welcome to a new series of Extra History. Before we start, I've got 2 announcements. Thanks to all of you who supported us on Patreon, Extra History is now its famous fight against the British. We'll see a small tribe become an empire. We'll see European factions playing out the game of power on South African shores. And we'll see a late post-Napoleonic army, well-drilled and equipped with modern rifles, be beaten by an indigenous population wielding nothing more than spears and hide shields. But before we can do so, we need to talk about sources. There's a lot about this period that we just don't know. It's not like the Sengoku Jidai, where it's simply hard to find translations of the more obscure records. In this case, we're dealing with a culture that didn't keep written records, so all we have to go on are scant accounts from European traders, and oral histories collected decades after the fact. Much of what we're going to tell you, especially about the early period we're covering, are best guesses by the historians and archaeologists who have worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle of exactly what transformed the Zulus, a tribe perhaps as small as 1,500 people living in an area probably around 10 square miles, into an empire of 250,000 people, ruling over an area roughly the size of New Jersey. So, with that caveat, let's start laying out the background. Who were the Zulu people when this all began? What did life look like for them? How did they subsist? What was their government, their economy, their military? Well, they were a relatively minor tribe within the larger Bantu people, who occupied a region in what would now be the eastern part of South Africa. They had a largely pastoral economy, with wealth being measured in cattle, and the population mostly subsisting on maize and milk. They operated under a kingship, but they had very little in the way of what we would consider centralized governance. And war? Well, when our story begins, somewhere in the end of the 18th century, warfare in this region was more of a ritual affair than a destructive endeavor. Warriors would meet at a predetermined location and fling spears and insults at one another, but would rarely move in for close-quarters fighting. This left the casualties very light, and it was almost unheard of for the winning side to follow up a victory by chasing down their opponents or sacking or conquering their land. Instead, battles would result in the transfer of a small amount of territory, or some cattle. But Shaka, who will be the central figure in the early part of our story, changed all this. He changed the weapons, the tactics, and perhaps most importantly, the philosophy of war in the region. He brought in close-quarters combat, replacing the traditional long throwing spear with a shorter thrusting spear that was devastating when used in a melee. He developed a system of envelopment tactics known as the bullhorn formation, which I'll explain in more detail later. And he changed war from a means of settling minor disputes to an activity of slaughter and conquest. So who was Shaka? Shaka was the eldest son of the leader of the Zulu people, but he was considered illegitimate, and so wasn't named the heir to the Zulu kingdom. In fact, his name, Shaka, means intestinal beetle, which was sort of the cover story for his mother's untimely pregnancy. This becomes kind of hilarious when you realize that we in the West often call him Shaka Zulu, and since the word Zulu actually means heaven in the Zulu language, we're basically calling him intestinal beetle heaven. So, enjoy that. Anyway, at the age of 7, because of his illegitimacy, Shaka was sent to live with his mother among the Ilangeni, a neighboring tribe. From there, he moved on to the Matetwa, the most powerful tribe in the region, where he served as a warrior first for a man named Job, and then for Job's successor, a man named Dingiswayo. Dingiswayo took notice of Shaka's unusual prowess as a close combat fighter, and when he discovered that Shaka was actually of royal blood, put him in charge of an ibuto, which you can basically think of as a regiment. And it's here that Shaka really began to refine his tactics. The traditional ibuto were armed with long throwing spears, and while they practiced the use of their weapons, they didn't do much in terms of practicing unit tactics. Generally, they would show up to the battlefield as more of a loose mob than a cohesive fighting unit. But Shaka began to experiment with this. He armed his men with the short stabbing spear, and drilled them in a tactic that he called the bullhorn. He'd split his men into 3 groups: the chest, the horns, and the loins. The chest would charge the enemy and pin them in hand-to-hand combat. Then the 2 branches of the horns, positioned to either side of the chest, would flank and envelop the pinned enemy. This whole time, the loins would sit behind the lines, acting as a rested reserve to be applied where needed. Interestingly, it's been said that Shaka would have these men sit with their backs to the fighting, so they wouldn't become panicked or charge overeagerly before he needed them. The brilliance of this system was that it was simple. Without much battlefield coordination, every man knew what he was supposed to do. If you're in the chest, you charge. If you're in the horns, you get around their flank. The system's simplicity meant that it could be applied in chaotic conditions, without much of the signaling that was required by modern armies. With these deadly new weapons and tactics, Shaka became a force to be reckoned with, and when his father died, he decided it was time to take his own. Shaka's half-brother, the legitimate heir, took the Zulu throne, but with the help of Dingiswayo, Shaka quickly had him assassinated, and simply moved in to take over the place. Dingiswayo was still the chief of the Zulus, so Shaka continued to serve him, but only a year later, Dingiswayo was killed by a man named Zwide, the ruler of the Ndwandwe, one of the most powerful tribes in the region. Shaka vowed vengeance for his leader's death, and stepped in to fill the void Dingiswayo had left behind, bringing the Matetwa, and with them many of the other local tribes, under his control. Shaka's vengeance, and the war he was about to bring, would lead to a period of unparalleled chaos and devastation. In Zulu, they call it the Mefakane. In English, we simply call it the crushing. But before we delve into the crushing, we should talk about why war here became genocide, and why the region was so primed to explode at the first signs of strife. A lot of it has to do with European influence. Not because Europeans tried to cause it, in fact there were many Europeans who tried to help, but given how radically different, how wealthy, how technologically separated the Europeans were from the local population, their mere presence dramatically destabilized the region. As European trade increased, new crops were introduced, which led to a population increase, which in turn led to greater competition for land. Meanwhile, European ships would trade for cattle to resupply their food stores, which made cattle even more valuable, and led to an increase in raiding. At the same time, European traders also came looking for ivory, and to get ivory, you have to take down elephants, which requires a large degree of coordination from a group of people, which some have said led to the more coordinated and far more deadly tactics that Shaka was able to implement. To add to all of this, a drought caused the more water-hungry European crops to fail, which led to a famine. So the area, Natal, was already primed for disaster. Join us next week as we explore Shaka's quest for vengeance, see his descent into madness, and witness the horrors of the crushing.
Okay, awesome. So, now I want you to write a summary of the most important points from this video. What have you learnt so far about this figure and the Zulu Empire? Why do you think Agard decided to include his name and this figure in his poem? Okay, so finally, let's now do a review and bring this back to what we've been learning about this half term. So how does this poem link to our work on Black Lives Matter? And how could we link this poem to the boy in striped pyjamas? Are there any similar themes or images which come up in this poem as in the text? And that's it for today. Thank you. Thank you for listening, and if you've got any questions on this, let me know. Maybe I haven't explained some of the tasks as well as I should have, so just let me know if you need some more help, okay? Again, thank you for listening.